Yes, thank you.
All right, but that was a good segue because we're talking about the halachic and ethical, Jewish ethical issues around the question of the COVID-19 vaccination. So the first thing, and this may sound a little bit weird to some people, but when we're looking at any sort of medical halachic question, one of the first things we need to do is kind of establish the permissibility of like healing or use of medicine in general. And that said to me, well, what are you talking about? I mean, that's like self-evident, but it's actually not self-evident. I mean, you know, we all know that there are religious groups that basically do not believe in, you know, seeing doctors or you know, if sick, right? And you will get well if God wants you to get well. And who are we to interfere in that process? Okay. Now, that's not a typical Jewish attitude. I mean, like, for example, Jews are about 2% of the population of the United States, but we're about 15% of the doctors in the United States. So, you know, well, sort of out of proportion. But, you know, nevertheless, that does need to be established. So the first sort of biblical text that establishes this is from, we'll read it actually in a couple of weeks, Exodus 21. When men quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and the man does not die but keeps his bed, then if the man rises again and walks abroad with his staff, he that struck him shall be clear. Only he shall pay for the loss of his time and shall have him thoroughly healed. Okay, so if you get into a fight and you injure somebody and they don't die, but they get better, you have to pay the loss of their time, and you have to pay for them to be healed. Now, so what does this demonstrate? Anyone? I mean, what does this have to do with the question of the permissibility of, you know, seeing a doctor or being a doctor?
So the doctor's the one who will determine whether or not they're going to get better, you know, how hurt they were.
Well, yeah, but not only that. In other words, you have to pay their doctor fees, right? You have to pay their medical bills. So if you have to pay their medical bills, right? I mean, if the Torah is saying you have to pay somebody's medical bill, right? Then it stands to reason that that's permissible, right? I mean, nobody would say, you know, the Torah would not say you have to pay for this guy's ham sandwich, right? You know, you would never have to pay for something that was not permissible in the first place, right? So from this, the rabbinic tradition deduces the acceptability of the medical profession, since the Torah would not command payment for an activity which is itself prohibited. Okay, there are other biblical texts that go into this as well. In Deuteronomy 22, if somebody loses something, you have the obligation to return it to them. Okay, it's called Hashevat Aveda. Now you say, well, return it to them. What does that have to do with anything? Well, what have they lost? They've lost their good health, right? If you have the ability to restore their good health, you have to do that. There's also in Leviticus, do not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. And finally, in Deuteronomy, I remember discussing this last year. towards the end in Deuteronomy 22, there's the mitzvah of a parapet. Okay, what is a parapet? A parapet is like, it's a low wall. Biblical times, roofs were flat. Air conditioning was non-existent. The roof was actually like a living space. People spent a lot of time on their roof. There are, cultures where this is still quite common. And so you have to build a low fence around your roof so that when people go up to your roof, they don't fall off. Okay, so again, a mitzvah, and this will connect to the question of the vaccine, because you have an obligation not only to look out for your own health, but to look out for the health of the public in general. Okay, so there's also in Deuteronomy 4:9, v'nishmartem ma'od al nafshotechem. You shall be very careful for your own well-being, right? In other words, there's a duty of self-care, okay? So that the normal kind of precautions that people would take, like like hand washing, or wearing masks, or physical distancing, are halachically required. Okay, now in most cases in the current circumstance, they're also required by state law, right? I mean, we have this principle of dina de malchuta dina, right? Which we've discussed in other contexts. Dina de malchuta dina means that the law of the land is the law, right? And therefore, under most circumstances, it is a Jewish religious obligation to obey governmental law, right? I mean, it's not just obviously, for fear of punishment, but it is a halachic obligation to follow governmental law. So that, for example, so aside from any other sort of practical considerations, if we were to hold services and not require masks, right? If we were to hold services and not enforce physical distancing, we would be violating state and county law. And in violating state and county law, we would also be violating the halakha. Okay, under most circumstances. The sort of the clearest example where that would where dina de malchuta would not apply is either if a law is discriminatory against Jews, right? Like, it's a halachic obligation to pay your taxes, right? If there were a law that said Jews have to pay double, you would not be halachically obligated to, it would be halachically permissible to evade that law if you could somehow get away with it, right? But your normal taxes, as long as, even if it's a bad law or an unfair law, if it doesn't single out Jews, it's halachically obligatory. Obviously, it also would not apply in a case where the halakha requires, where the law requires you to violate halakha. Like, if there, a lot of cultures, for example, eat pork on New Year's Day. Right? If there was a law that said, everybody in Maryland, or let's say crabs, right? Everybody in Maryland has to eat crabs once a year. The halakha would not only not obligate you to follow that law, but would obligate you to try and not follow that law, but not at the cost of your life, right? But so in general, we do have to follow the law. Okay, so this brings us to the question of the vaccine, right? Now, we start with the presumption, with the assumption, as we've seen. I mean, we're up to now um, over 400,000 deaths in this country due to the coronavirus pandemic, and that's probably an undercount because excess mortality is more than 400,000 in the 10 months of the pandemic. So, it's clearly it's a risk, and because it is so contagious, it spreads so easily, right? So there's a great public risk. So, vaccines. I mean, I was in a way surprised when I started looking into it. I did not realize that vaccines go back to the late 1700s. I mean, I suppose at some point in history read about Dr. Jenner and the smallpox vaccine. But when I think about the state of medicine not that long ago, to think that, I mean, the smallpox vaccine goes back to 1795. And so there had been a lot of halachic discussion about the smallpox vaccine. And I also did not realize that prior to the development of the vaccine, smallpox killed about 400,000 people a year in Europe, which is really astonishing considering, the population of Europe at the time. But already in the 18th and 19th century, there were well-known poskim, well-known halachic authorities who ruled that it was obligatory to take the smallpox vaccine. Okay, and in general, a medical a vaccine or other type of medical intervention can be considered obligatory if it's what's known as a rifu'ah b'duka, okay, which means like a proven remedy, right? If it's a proven remedy, then we can be halachically obligated to use it. Okay. Now, what does it mean, a proven treatment? The likelihood of success is fairly high and the risk is fairly minimal, right? And certainly, I mean, if you would have said that the smallpox vaccine is a rifu'ah b'duka, a proven treatment, I mean, there you're dealing actually with live viruses, right? And so I think, and Becky, you can probably correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm delving into science, which is where I probably should not go. But the smallpox than the COVID vaccines, right? Especially since the COVID vaccines don't actually contain any live virus, right? It's really, it's more like genetic information to your body to start based on based on everything that we know so far. The risk is fairly minimal, and the likelihood of success is pretty high. We can, I think, pretty safely say that the halacha requires you under normal circumstances to take the coronavirus vaccine. Right now, any halachic decision has to be weighed in terms of the individual's particular situation, right? So, if your doctor tells you you should not take the vaccine, then obviously you should not take the vaccine. Right now, again, I don't know what medical conditions would contraindicate somebody taking the vaccine, but I'm sure that there are. And therefore, obviously, then you shouldn't. But assuming, that is assuming that a qualified physician actually makes that determination. But for people for whom there is no medical contraindication, there is no basis in halakha to claim a religious objection to the vaccine. If your doctor tells you you should take it, then you must take it halachically. Even on Shabbat, right? Even on Shabbat, like I there was this seminar earlier this week, and a colleague who lives in Canada, where they are assigning you a slot. Okay, you're not signing up for it. You are getting a notice. I don't know whether by email or telephone or mail, but you are getting a notice that says your appointment is at such and such a time in such and such a place. And she was given a slot on Shabbat. And the question was, what do I do? And now it depends on the realia. I mean, if you have a slot on Shabbat and all you need to do is, go online with a couple of clicks or make a phone call and you can move it to a different day, then that's one thing. But in this particular province in Canada, if you don't make your assigned slot, you will wait weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. And so, the answer was very clear. You must take it even on Shabbat. All right. Now, and in Israel, the vaccination clinics are operating on Shabbat. Okay. Now you may say, well, so what? But if you're familiar with Israel, you would never say, so what? Because governments have fallen over these kinds of questions, right? Can the buses operate on Shabbat? Can movie theaters be open on Shabbat? Can, Rabin's government once fell because of air traffic on Shabbat, but there have been no objections whatsoever to the vaccination clinics being open on Shabbat, because the goal is to get as many people vaccinated as quickly as possible. And Israel, certainly compared to the United States, is doing a really really good job. And so so the question of the vaccine on Shabbat, it's not an issue. Now, I would not say that, if you're going to sign up, you should pick a time on Shabbat. But if you are assigned a time on Shabbat, or that's, you can do it on Shabbat, or you're going to have to wait a long time, you should definitely do it on Shabbat, because it's a question of pikuach nefesh. It's a question of saving lives. Okay. Are there any questions or comments so far? Because I'm just throwing a lot of stuff at you, and it makes me uncomfortable. I like to engender discussion and answer questions. So, Sue,
Rabbi, I had one.
Sue.
Oh, go ahead.
I don't. I just wonder if it matters what the.
Sue first.
Does it matter what the shot is actually, or the medicine is actually made of? Like, would the ingredients all have to pass, kosher standards?
Okay. Absolutely not. I mean, in point of fact, as far as I know, both the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines do not contain any problematic ingredients. But even if they did, it's not an issue. It would be for Muslims, I'm told, because Muslims have a different understanding. But the prohibition in Judaism is on eating something treif, right? It's not on being injected with something treif, and it's not on having something transplanted into your body. Like I get, a question sometimes. I mean, it's usually like a question out of interest, not a question of like actual case where they have to decide what to do, right? But at least at one point, and I don't know if it's the case anymore, but it used to be fairly common to transplant pig valves into human hearts. The anatomy is fairly similar.
It's still common.
Absolutely not an issue. I mean, it would be an issue, I suppose, if the operation was taking place via the throat. But since it's not right. There's no issue whatsoever. And even if it was a problem, it's not a problem, because this concept of pikuach nefesh, right? That you can and must do everything necessary to save lives. Not you must do everything necessary to save lives, but you can and must violate any prohibition in order to save lives, right? Other than you're not allowed to commit murder or shed another person's blood or engage in sexual immorality in order to save a life, but save your own life. But other than that, so that even if, it's hard for me to imagine, but if you went to the doctor and the doctor said, Sue, you have this very rare medical condition, and the only way you're going to survive is if you eat 3 slices of bacon every morning, right? You must eat 3 slices of bacon every morning. There's no question about it, right? There's no, assuming that the doctor. Now, here's where that kind of question does come up, where people like calcium supplements, right? Which are sometimes made from like crustacean shells, right? And and I've gotten that question. And then there's a follow-up question. In other words, who told you to take this, right? If it's your friend from the mahjong game says this is really good and you should take it, no. I mean, unless your friend from the mahjong game is also a physician, right? If your physician says you should take it, then as far as I'm concerned, you should take it, period. If it's a prescribed treatment that your physician says you need, then you need it. There's no question whatsoever, even if it's, glot treif. Okay, Joe, you had a question.
Yes, Rabbi, you mentioned, you pointed out that there are, members of different religious faiths who disagree with medical intervention. And we know that some of our brethren Jews are like that. And in regards to COVID, the Hasidim haven't been all that good at social distancing and wearing masks. They read the same Torah we do. So what verses would they cite to justify their refusal to go home?
Right. Well, I don't think that they would challenge the halacha. They would possibly challenge the medical realia, right? In other words, if there's a life-threatening disease and a proven treatment, you must get the proven treatment, right? Those are 2 big ifs: life-threatening disease and proven treatment. So I think some of them would deny that it's a life-threatening disease, or that they would deny that it's a proven treatment. Or there's also a verse that some people rely on, God protects the innocent. all right, so that they would simply say God is gonna protect us, right? Or, there's also a principle, or a saying, shluchei mitzvah einan nizokin, right? Somebody who's engaged, an emissary for a mitzvah is not hurt. Like if, right, somebody's going to Israel, you give them mitzvah money, right? What's that all about? Right? Because now, they're going to Israel to donate your tzedakah. That's a mitzvah. They're now protected. Right? Now, we understand that midrashically. I mean, nobody understands that literally, but they might understand it literally. But I would say that, to the extent that you have these communities that don't follow these practices, I would say it's not halachic ignorance, it's scientific ignorance. And this is a problem in that community, right? I mean, they don't, in principle, don't believe in higher education, right? So, it's a problem. All right, anybody else?
I do.
Yeah, D.
For people who are interested, I don't know if you can see this or not. You can't, I'm sorry. This is a fact sheet for recipients, meaning anybody who's going to get the Moderna vaccine. This speaks to a question I believe that Sue asked. And you can get it on the Moderna website. And on the second page in the middle, it cites the specific ingredients of the vaccine itself.
Oh, great.
And then it's like 3 lines. But from what I can tell, and I'm not a pharmacist either, there doesn't seem to be any kind of animal product in this. But the interesting thing is, I think everybody here, almost everybody here, has probably had a colonoscopy and thereby has taken something called Go Lightly, or the chemical that makes you,
Right.
okay, that's got the same ingredients in it that antifreeze has. And so obviously in a certain proportion, so does this. But most of these things are polyethylene, cholesterol, lipids, hydrochloride, acetic acid, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not talking about meat products, but if you're interested, it's got much more than the ingredients. The
Right.
website from Moderna.
Yeah, Mike, muted. Mike, you're muted.
You're right, I am.
Yeah.
So sorry about that. So in light of what you said, there's a over-the-counter medicine called glucosamine with chondroitin and MSM,
Right.
and it is designed to help your joints not ache. And it contains shrimp,
Right.
obviously in a totally different form, but it's the shell of the shrimp that's in the medicine.
Right.
So the question is, are you saying since it's not prescription, we cannot take it? Are you saying that if we encourage the doctor to tell us to, then we can take it? Or are you saying that it's less than 1/60th and so we don't even have to worry?
All right.
Where do you start?
No, I mean, here's the thing. Something does not have to be a prescription drug
To be
to
needed.
be prescribed to you by your physician.
Right.
Okay.
Right. I mean, I take a couple of over-the-counter supplements that, you walk in, I buy them on Amazon, right? But my doctor told me to take them.
Right.
So therefore, I don't even feel a need to look at the ingredients. If your doctor tells you you should take it, then that's it as far as I'm concerned. Beyond that, I mean, chondroitin is exactly the one that people ask about, right? I mean, and I have to say that I'm not expert enough to give you like a definitive halachic answer. But I mean, there are all kinds of issues, whether it's, first of all, whether it's derech achila, right? In other words, in general, I would say taking a pill is not derech achila. It's not eating, right? You're swallowing a pill. You're not eating it. You're not chewing it. You're not tasting it. You're not deriving benefit from the flavor of it, right? So it's not eating in the sense that of people eating, right? There's also, I mean, if the size of it, if it's less than a kazayit, if it's less than an olive bulk, you're not culpable, right? And so, I would, having said that, again, if your doctor tells you to take it, that's the end of the story, right? If you've read somewhere that this is good, if there's an alternative formulation that doesn't have the shrimp shells, it would be better,
Sure.
right? But if your doctor tells you to take it, then you have to take it, as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, so as a follow-up question that I don't expect you to deal with tonight, but I'll just put it out there. You got to ask, I have to ask, how relevant in these situations do we want halacha to be? Because there's an obvious common sense medical or whatever answer that says we should do Zoom on Shabbos and we should read Torah and we should blow shofar. And then there's the halachic requirements, which we then bend over backwards to try and fit the square peg into the round hole. But the question, at some point, someday when you have time, I mean, why should we, how much effort, how much impetus, how much should we give to the very question of halacha when it's common sense in the world we live in and there's no harm done other than halacha?
Well, because what's common sense to you is not what's common sense to somebody else. I mean, that's the answer. And I think that, any field of endeavor has its rules, right? Any field of endeavor has its rules. And, if I'm playing baseball and, why not just run directly to second base? It's quicker. It's quicker. And, that's where I need to be. So why should I bother going to, let's just go through the pitcher's mound to second, right? I mean, that's just, and, there are people for whom this really matters, right? And there are people who will willingly die rather than violate this,
Yeah.
right? They tend not to be found in our congregation, right?
Well, because it's a choice once made, you're no longer in the congregation.
Right, but
Don't go there, Mike.
no, but there are people, for whom they
For sure.
will die
sure.
rather than
Yeah.
violate this stuff, and therefore I think the spade work needs to be done. All right, so I want to move on to the next issue. Okay, so the question now is, can a Jewish school or a synagogue or another Jewish institution, can they require vaccination? And the answer is yes. Not only you can, but you really should, right? Now, obviously, I mean, a couple of things. Obviously, we as a shul cannot make our congregants get vaccinated. That is obvious, right? I mean,
Why? Why is it so
what?
obvious? Why, when we
use
open,
our-
why
we
can't
use
we
our
say
No, we
everybody
can't-
who's
no.
vaccinated is welcome?
You didn't listen very carefully to what I said. We cannot make our congregants get vaccinated.
True.
We absolutely can say nobody's allowed in the building unless they have been vaccinated, or, have a note from their physician that the vaccine is contraindicated for them, right? That we absolutely can do, and I would argue should do, right? Now, if somebody, that's what I'm saying. We don't have, as opposed to, a Hasidic community, right? If in a Hasidic community, the Rebbe says everybody must get vaccinated, that's it, right? If I say everybody must get vaccinated, right? Well, very nice. That's your opinion, Rabbi, right? But if the board passes a policy that says, nobody is allowed in the building unless they've been vaccinated, that is a perfectly legitimate policy. And schools, the same thing, right? Now, here's where you get a little bit of paradox, right? And those of you who know me well enough know me that I love paradoxes, right? So let's say we have a kid who's enrolled in our Hebrew school, right? And they are not vaccinated. And the reason they are not vaccinated is because their parents believe they have a religious objection to getting vaccinated, right? And so the kid goes to MCPS because MCPS recognizes their religious objection to being vaccinated. We nevertheless can and should say we don't recognize that exemption. And then they say, but I have this religious exemption from MCPS, and now you're telling me I can't send my kid to religious school despite the religious exemption. And the answer is, yeah, exactly, because from the perspective of not only conservative Judaism, but of the Orthodox Union as well, there is no Jewish religious basis to claim an exemption, right? And then you say, but the state recognizes it, right? And here's where there's a little bit of irony, okay? The state, I mean, what is the question that the state is allowed to ask? All right. Is your belief sincerely held? Right? That's all they're allowed to ask, right? You cannot go to the MCPS office and say, I claim a religious exemption. And then, the person in the MCPS says, but you're Jewish and Judaism doesn't recognize this, right? MCPS cannot do it, right? The state is not allowed to decide what your religion actually says or whether you get your own religion correctly. They're not allowed to decide that. The only question they can ask is, are you sincere? Right? And whereas we can say, you're sincere, but you're sincerely wrong. Right? And we are not gonna allow your kid in Hebrew school or nursery school or whatever until they get vaccinated. Alan.
Thank you. I don't know MCPS rules, and I suspect many times they don't either. But
Be careful.
but in other kinds of law, the issue is whether it's your your real belief. And then the question is the belief reasonable?
Right.
And I think that would be a part of it. Although it came to me, and I'm sorry to say this, but it came to me that if there was an intermarriage where the mother was Jewish, the father was Muslim, and for whatever his reason, he didn't want that sort of vaccine to be injected, they're both right. But we as a congregation would then still be right to say our rules, and we're not completely under the public rules that they have in the schools,
Right.
are that you have to be vaccinated to go to our synagogue, to go to our facility.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, we have that right. I mean, but when you mention a case of intermarriage, right, this is precisely where lower courts sometimes commit reversible error, right? By delving into what is the actual doctrine, okay? Where you have, for example, a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother, right? Which in Reform Judaism, that kid could still be Jewish, right? And then they separate and so on and so forth. And, and the mother now wants, or the father wants full custody on the basis that the mother won't raise them as Jews, which was the prior agreement, right? And then the mother's lawyer will try and find an Orthodox rabbi to come in and say, but the kid's not even Jewish, right? And if the judge listens to that, that's going to be a reversible error, because
I think that's reversible error.
Because the judge is not allowed to decide, yeah, orthodoxy is true and reform is false, or whatever.
In that one though, the real issue, and of course this comes up all the time, which is so unfortunate. And a lot of times divorcing couples won't agree in writing that today is Thursday. Each one will tell you today is Thursday, but they won't agree to it. And so what you have is, if there's an agreement, that's one thing, but if not, each side can raise, when they have the child, they can take the child wherever,
Right.
to whatever religious school, albeit that's going to cause great problems to a child, I suspect. And then you go in with your expert who says, well, the fact that there's so much confusion about where the child has to worship should be put in the mix.
But
Right.
we're a private organization. We should have the opportunity in any event to decide who's allowed in the building.
That's right.
That's right.
Right. No, we do. And I mean, in general, a lot of generally applicable laws don't
They
apply
don't apply to us.
to us, in general. But I just found it interesting, that you could have a situation where a kid is not vaccinated because of a religious exemption, and the public school says that's fine, and the shul still says, no dice. Okay. So, so we have the right to require vaccination before you come into the building, unless you've got a medical exemption, in which case that person who, comes to shul anyway, even though they haven't been vaccinated, they have to be especially careful about mask wearing and social distancing and so on, at least until we achieve herd immunity. Finally, I want to discuss a little bit about priorities, okay? In terms of, yeah.
Sorry, may I ask one question?
Please.
So let me think about how to say this. If lawfully we want to prevent hurting somebody,
Right.
In the event that someone has an exception from their doctor in terms of not getting the vaccine because there's some worry about adverse reactions, you're saying that that person should be able to go to shul, but is that permissible for the rest of the members? Because the vaccine trial data show that it's effective in preventing us from getting the actual disease COVID-19, but there's no data showing that
Right.
the vaccine can prevent us from transmitting the virus asymptomatically.
Right.
So if someone with an exception from a doctor who has not gotten the vaccine were to go to shul with people that have gotten the vaccine, isn't there a concern that we could, without knowing it, transmit the virus to this unvaccinated person?
No, absolutely. I mean, I asked that same exact question on Monday at the law committee, and the answer was, look, I mean, even the vaccine is not 100% either. It's 95%, right? So there's never going to be a situation where you can, say with absolute certainty there's no risk of transmission. So that the person who cannot be vaccinated for medical reasons, right? I mean, we don't want to be in a position of saying, therefore, you can never come to shul again, right? So just they have to, and you certainly know the medical realia better than I do, right? But each thing that we do lessens the risk, right? Wearing a mask lessens the risk. Physical distancing lessens the risk. Vaccine lessens the risks. Doing stuff outdoors rather than indoors lessens the risk, right? Proper ventilation, et cetera, right? So that, if you have, 25 people in shul and one of them cannot be vaccinated, and they're very, because at least in the early stages, right, people are still going to have to wear masks and maintain distancing and so on and so forth. I mean, it's the one thing that we learned. It's not an on-off switch, right? So that, people, the feeling is, if you have this small minority of unvaccinated people because they can't be vaccinated, if everybody's wearing masks and maintaining distancing, it should probably be okay, right? Because it's not, I mean, and I have, earlier in the pandemic, when other shuls were saying, well, we're having services in a safe way, and I would lace into them, because no, it's not safe, it's just less risky. And to tell somebody that this is safe, it's not safe, right? But on the other hand, nothing is safe, right? I mean, we ask people to pick up bags of food and deliver them to hungry people, right? Driving a car is a risky activity, right? But I mean, nothing in life is completely without risk. It's all a question of how to mitigate it. All right. So, I mean, my initial inclination was I asked exactly the same question, right? But there's a certain point. I mean, what you tell somebody they can never go to shul ever again? I mean, that's not really. I mean, some people might be very happy to be told that, right? But other people, that would be, a major loss for them. Anyway, okay, so
Gracias, Ramiro.
what?
Gracias.
De nada. All right, so now the question is, how do we decide who goes first, right? And this is a complicated question, and I have to say that, here really we are dealing in theory more than practice, right? Because we as a shul are not in a position to determine what are the priorities for vaccines, right? But if, in in many places there is a commission that is deciding on priorities, and in many places there may be a rabbi with an expertise in bioethics, or a Jewish physician with an expertise in Jewish bioethics who's serving on those committees, right? So there are 4 moral principles to guide any sort of triage decision, okay? And they can be in tension with each other, right? First principle is treating people equally. All right. Now, what that means is treating people equally within the same sort of group of people, right? So that if the rule is everybody over 75 is now eligible for the vaccine, then it should be either first come, first serve, or a lottery or whatever. You shouldn't be, selling slots or, whatever. I mean, everybody's entitled to equal treatment. Favoring the worst off on the basis of the rule of rescue. Maximizing total benefits measured either by the number of lives saved or the number of life years saved. Okay. And that's one of the arguments that, we're favoring the elderly, right? Maybe we should favor the young, right? Because if my, right, so my dad who's 91 has an appointment next week, right? I mean, he lives in New York City. It's a mess, right? But if he, God forbid, dies of COVID, right? What is the loss of years of life? It's not that many, right? But a 30-year-old who dies of COVID, right? There's 50, 60 years of life lost. So, that's a question. I mean, our instinct is, the elderly should go first, but you could actually construct an argument that says otherwise. And then the last principle is promoting and rewarding social usefulness based either on instrumental value for the future of the society or on reciprocity for past conditions, including those on the front lines of fighting COVID-19. Right. And here, I mean, halacha is consequentialist in that regard, right? Like, for example, in New York and in some other cities, there's an organization called Hatzalah, right, which is an Orthodox Jewish ambulance service, right? And obviously they take you to the hospital on Shabbos, right? Obviously. Once they've taken you to the hospital on Shabbos, they are allowed to drive back home. Now, you could say, but that's ridiculous, right? You're only allowed to drive to save a life, right? Once you've gotten the person to the hospital, there's no life saving anymore, right? But the concern is, you know what? He's not that sick, right? Last time I went to the hospital at 3:00 in the morning and I was stuck in the hospital till 7:00 at night. He's not really that sick. I'm not answering the call, right? And you could push that argument even to a private person who drives somebody to the hospital, right? That if you, and here is where there's this sort of rare situation where you're actually allowed to make your own decision, right? Where if you honestly feel that the risk of being stuck at the hospital for all of Shabbos will serve as a negative motivation the next time you're actually allowed to drive back on Shabbos, because we're concerned about what might happen in the future, right? So similarly, right? I mean, it's one of the reasons why PPE and vaccines and whatever go first to those who are on the front lines, so that they'll be willing to be on the front lines. So that there, as I said, that consequentialist argument. Okay. Now there's an interesting text that some of you may be familiar with, and it's a text that is used in terms of making sort of triage or rationing decisions. Okay, it's from Bava Metzia 62a. If two people were walking, in the desert or whatever, and there was a jug of water in the possession of one of them, and the situation was such that if both drink from the jug, both will die, as there's not enough water, but if only one of them drinks, he will reach a settled area. There's a dispute on the halakha, right? You understand the situation? Two people walking through the desert. There's enough water for one person. If one person drinks, they'll be able to get to the next city. If they both drink, they're both gonna die. Okay, so what do you do? Okay, Ben Petora taught it is preferable that both of them drink and die, and let neither one of them see the death of the other. This was the accepted opinion until Rabbi Akiva came and taught that the verse states, "And your brother shall live with you," indicating that your life takes precedence over the life of the other. Okay, now you say, live with me, meaning live with you, not live instead of you, right? So that, right, the two of you are in the desert, it's your water, you drink it, okay? Rather than both of them die. You're not obligated to give it to the other person, right? You're not obligated to share it. You drink it because it's your water and your life takes precedence, right? Now, can the other person steal the water from you because, after all, I won't save no, right? I mean, but we have a resource, right? There's one unit for two people. The person to whom it belongs gets to keep it, right? So in essence, we derive that we don't want to be so fair that everybody dies, right? So that if there's 100 doses and 1,000 people, right? I mean, fairness would say give everybody a tenth of a dose, right? And then but that doesn't do any good, right? So give it to 100 people. And if I am fortunate enough to be on that list, I don't have to give up my slot for somebody else, right? Assuming that the decision-making process is fair. Okay, so basically, and this is the last point, right? So taking into account all of these principles, using personal connections, influence, or financial means to receive the COVID-19 vaccine sooner than our allotted time is forbidden, right? You're not allowed to try and jump the queue. I mean, I don't even know. I mean, we know in Brooklyn that already happened, that there, of course, in Brooklyn, right? That there was a clinic that had a supply of vaccine and they were not following the distribution requirements. Now, people who got it said that they were unaware. Okay, but I don't know. But you can't pull strings, right, to get the vaccine. Which certainly raises the question about members of Congress who simultaneously deny the existence of the disease and say it's not that serious, and also are the first in line to get the vaccine, right? But it's, now you certainly, if you know that registration opens at midnight, right, and you want to, get online at midnight, that's absolutely fine. But you halachically cannot, jump the queue or try to bribe the registrar or whatever. I mean, you have to follow the procedure as it's been established. I mean, on the assumption that, the whole procedure has been, done in a way that's basically ethical, even if you might disagree, with the priorities. All right. So any questions or comments? Gail, please.
I want to make one relative to the vaccinations. Vaccinations were actually available in like 1736. And one of Ben Franklin's biggest concerns was that he didn't get his son, and it wasn't inoculated. They used to run a string through of cowpox, and his son died of smallpox. So back in 1736, they knew it was viable technique.
Great. All right. All right. Good night, folks. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Very
Thank-
interesting.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Good night.
Good night.
Right.